All right, so if you were here 5 minutes ago when I said Fail of Things is right now, I in fact read the schedule, and it is at 3 o'clock, my mistake. Next up we have Becker Polverini with How to Turn Joy into Sadness, a very favorite topic of mine, Common Cryptography Anti-Patterns.
Hey everybody, how's it going? So yeah, my name is Becker, and I'm going to be talking today on when crypto goes rogue, which happens more often than you'd think. This talk hopefully isn't too depressing. I try to put some levity into it, but I think it comes as no surprise to everyone in this room that cryptography is really hard to get right. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that it goes terribly, terribly wrong. So just to get started, I'm Becker. I'm the CEO and co-founder of PKC Security. We're a custom software development shop in Huntington Beach, so we're local-ish. Failed academic. My background is in actually intrusion detection systems, so I'm not a real cryptographer, but definitely in cybersecurity. I've written and seen and fixed a lot of bad crypto. So what our company does in particular is we make wrong software projects right. It's sort of our mission. So companies will hire us when a software project is on the ropes, either in terms of budget or time or resource. And we'll come in and take a look at their infrastructure, at their code, and try to get the project working again. A lot of times what this looks like is crypto. Our background, myself and my co-founders, all of our backgrounds are in cybersecurity, so a lot of times we get invited to projects that have a security element. What that means is that we have the misfortune of seeing some tremendously awful code. And this talk, all the examples in this talk have come from real consulting arrangements that we've done. We've obviously taken out all of the identifying stuff, but just to give you a sample of kind of what's in the wild, and it can be pretty depressing. So crypto's a beautiful thing, right? It's kind of amazing that 128 bits, just 128 ones and zeros can protect data in one of the most impenetrable ways in the known universe, right? Such a small amount of data has such an amazing amount of stopping power, and that's really impressive. It's beautiful when you think about it, but it can get really ugly. So the common adage, right, is don't roll your own crypto. But what people, don't roll your own crypto. If you want to try to come up with your own block cipher, that's probably a very bad idea. But the problem is, most of the people I hope in this room know you're not supposed to go try to roll your own block cipher. But we still have to use crypto. At some point we are using an implementation of a primitive, right? Either a pseudorandom function, HMAX, something. We're using some primitive, right, that takes some amount of knowledge and sophistication to use correctly. So you're not, at what point are you rolling your own crypto, right? How do you apply it then? This is really the question that people don't answer. They sort of say and throw in the community, don't roll your own crypto at you, but they don't tell you actually sometimes how to use it correctly. And this talk is kind of an attempt to help everyone get like a base amount of knowledge about how to use just a handful of cryptographic primitives so that you can avoid the common mistakes that people make when they're not rolling it, but they're kind of applying it, and knowing what that's supposed to look like when it's done right. So this is my favorite example is Stack Overflow gives us so much business. People go to Stack Overflow and they find all kinds of great answers for crypto. Like my favorite is a really strong algorithm called base64 encryption. Oh wait, that's not how that works. So you see this and this answer's got so much wrong in it, right? It's just a beautiful cacophony of crypto. It's just terrible, right? You got base64 being used as some kind of encryption. And then the person's recommendation, or it's like, maybe I should just use MD5. And then, this guy down in the comments says not knowing your user's password is not a downside, which it's a downside. You don't want to give up people's passwords if you get hacked. You want to be able to get rid of that sensitive material if you can and not keep it. And then some comment about using assault, and then this recommendation to just MD5 a few times. And you're thinking, well, this is a whole lot of wrong, right? So, this sucks, but, look behind the curtain and you're like, how many web apps are doing this right now, right? But you're thinking, all right, that's just the bad answer, right? Surely the most upvoted answer will be correct. It has to be. It's enough eyeballs, right? And you would be so wrong, so incredibly wrong. You've got more wrong all over. You've got, this example of like, well, why don't you just throw assault in there? And, well, we all know MD5 is bad, so let's just use SHA-1 instead. And, Instead of that, let's do totally timing unsafe equality checking for the result. And you start realizing that while it's easy to crap on people for rolling their own crypto or doing it wrong, this is actually really hard to get right. And I feel like as a community of the crypto community, it's not very humble, right? If you're too scared to, sorry? I'm saying like, what's up? Oh, it's a joke? Oh, okay. I thought I was sitting there defending. I was like, well, from my observation. But you got to start somewhere, I guess. And hopefully this talk is a way of saying that a lot of people make these mistakes. It's not okay that they're being made, but it is okay to experiment and learn and get better. But this sort of crap sinks a lot of companies, leaving you feeling like there's just no hope. So where are we going with this, right? We're going to talk just about a handful of really common cryptographic primitives that are sort of superglued in lots of different ways to build common stuff, right? Like maybe login, or I want to encrypt some binary blob, or common things that you'll find yourself wanting to do eventually in security that are sometimes deceptively easy to screw up. And especially if you look on the internet, these are the kind of things that people are going to recommend to you, and it's not going to end well. So we're going to go down the line. We'll start with passwords, good place to start, right? Talk about some ciphers and how to use particularly block ciphers correctly. We'll talk about max, how do you make sure that a message isn't malleable, right? You don't want people just flipping bits in the message. And then we're going to end with kind of a nihilistic ending, but basically 4 safe algorithms that you can kind of use with confidence, or libraries, ways of just sort of guardrailing yourself, so when you're going out and trying some of this stuff, hopefully not anything that's anywhere dangerous, but as you're kind of experimenting, a way to sort of get your feet wet and start testing this stuff. So we'll start off with passwords. So let's start with this. This is sort of the one that everybody starts with when they're thinking about a password, right? They're like, well, I don't want to store it, so I'll just hash it with something. And like, well, this is wrong for a lot of reasons. The biggest reason being that hash functions are meant to be fast, right? In this case, the biggest issue is that you can use something like a rainbow table or a dictionary, right? You can compute all the common passwords with MD5. So people have kind of realized that this is not the way to fly. So they say, well, what you should do is, don't use MD5, use some other pseudorandom function, and, use assault. That way now you've defeated at least one attack. But this doesn't defeat the attack of hash functions. Just are supposed to be fast. That's how they're designed. And in reality, you don't want it to be fast. You want to slow down the attacker if they're trying to test whether or not a password is valid, either online or offline. You want them to have to work for it. So, people start doing twists on it, like, okay, well then just do it a whole bunch of times, right? Take this fast thing, and if you do fast thing a lot, it becomes slow thing. But then there are all kinds of problems with this implementation, right? It keeps getting worse. You start looking at it, and you're like, what is going on in terms of the number of iterations? Like, am I even checking the lengths of stuff? It seems like, if you did it this way, the length of the password would affect how fast or how slow it would be. So then people start doing crazier stuff, like, okay, well, let's, check lengths and start making sure that things are constant time, but it's still fundamentally kind of messed up. And these are all examples of stuff we've seen from our audits. Was, something like this, right? Obviously, I renamed it to bad. But, people trying to hand roll these password-based key derivation functions so that they can take something that is pretty non-random, like a password. Like, if you think about it, it's not that random, and generate, a little bit of, real pseudo-randomness, but the way in which they're doing it is totally messed up. So now what, right? The truth of the matter is just stop trying to reinvent this. So this is probably the only part of the talk that is don't roll your own crypto. There's a handful of algorithms that do this correctly, and trying to do this any other way is basically folly. So there's a couple algorithms in particular that I've outlined here. The top 2 are probably the most common that you'll see are scrypt and Argon 2. But they have this notion of a time-memory trade-off. So when we talked about the PRF being fast and trying to make it slow, we didn't say anything about how much memory it takes. And it turns out that, not to get the tinfoil hat on too hard, but since this is a room full of security people, I can totally do that and not feel like a loser. You guys all rock. If you're a nation state, right, some of our clients have to worry about the nation state threat, and you imagine having a whole room full of ASICs, right, or FPGAs that you can burn to really quickly compute it, then it's slow on your general purpose processor, but really fast for your adversary that has billions of dollars thrown at this problem, NSA. You can't really let this happen, right? So the way that you do that is you use these much more sophisticated algorithms that not only take a long time to compute, but they take a lot of memory, something that won't fit easily on an FPGA or an ASIC that allows you to have parity with these bad guys. So now let's talk about the other part of the bad answer on passwords, which was this part, right? They did this, obviously they didn't do script, but they did some check like this, where they take two, essentially, bit strings, and they want to check whether or not they're equal, right? I'm sure if some of you have done the capture the flag, you've seen the crypto challenges. A lot of them are based on things like timing attacks or side channels, right? Like you time things. And a big issue in crypto is when you screw this up. So for example, in this, you have a side channel and how long it will take to check whether or not it's a valid user, right? If both strings start with, if one starts with A and one starts with B, that will take less time than if it goes A, B, right? And that is a side channel that tells you some information about the secret that you're trying to find out. So you want to avoid that, right? So you do something like this. Now there's a bug in this code, and it's subtle, right? Or maybe it isn't for those of you who are really good at code. But ultimately, this is almost a good solution. So there are ways to check the lengths of bits, for example, that are constant in the amount of, they're constant in time, right? So if you have 128 bits here, 128 bits here, it doesn't matter how similar the bits, the bit vectors are, it will actually take the same amount of time. Now, this one's fun for us because when we were doing an audit, we realized there was a bug in this. If you notice, it only checks the length of A, not the length of B. So you don't know that the lengths are equal. So it turns out in this one, if you pass A the blank string, it always passes, which led to abject horror. You have to be very careful with PPKDFs and with doing things like making sure things are constant time. It's really important in crypto. And it's something that a lot of things glance over. It's not necessarily the number of bits in your key material. It sometimes is just you get screwed over by a side channel. The rule of thumb here with PPKDFs is be lazy. There are good libraries out there that implement good algorithms. Scrypt and Argon 2 are the ones that I highlighted. Any library worth its salt for those algorithms will come with a way to do timing safe equality checks. Please make sure to use them because they get defeated all the time. It's sort of like timing checks and compression are the ways that cryptography can get defeated a lot of times by a side channel. Just a quick segue here too on key derivation functions. So this time, let's say you're not trying to take a password and get randomness. You've got a little bit of randomness and you want to get a little bit more key material. Like let's say you did one Diffie-Hellman, right? So you did your Diffie-Hellman exchange, you got your shared secrets, but you need to init up a bunch of stuff. Like, you need to init up a bunch of HMACs, a bunch of different algorithms, and you want to be able to sort of derive more from that little bit of key material. People come up with all kinds of weird homegrown ways to do this. This is the one that I would just recommend that you only use this approach. And it's called HKDF. It's very simple. Just put the key material into an HMAC with some sort of salt, and then you just sort of continue to digest information like that, and that will generate good material for you. So the reason why I bring this up is because a lot of bad things happen because of key reuse. Obviously, if you use the same key, for example, in like Galois Countermode for the macking part of it, as you do the encryption part, you run into all kinds of problems. You just never want to reuse keys, either sending receiving keys or MAC and encryption keys. You also don't want to do unnecessary Diffie-Hellman if you can avoid it. And it's a really simple way to eliminate a lot of problems, particularly in protocols that involve exchange. So on that, some of the things that I mentioned around like ciphers and cipher modes, we're going to talk a little bit about block ciphers and how to use them correctly. This is another area where people sometimes shoot themselves in the foot. So block ciphers are algorithms that operate on fixed length blocks. So there's a lot of different kinds of block ciphers, so I won't talk too much about that. But basically, it's what we can do this with the mental model that we normally have for a cipher. Like you give it a key, and then it can permute that and generate something that you can XOR with plain text, or you can put plain text into it and have it get permuted. There are lots of different ways that they work, but basically it's a key that when given some input scrambles it to some deterministic output that can be reversed. And one of the things that people don't talk about, people spend a lot of time arguing about what's the right algorithm. You know, should you be using AES? Should you be using Cha-Cha? Should you be using, three fish or some like weird algorithm? And what they don't spend a lot of time talking about are actually cipher modes. So like, how do you take this block cipher that, you know, takes a block and like moves it around? How do you convert that into something that can encrypt lots of different messages? Or you can pull on it and get lots of random bits out of it. Like, they don't really explain how you apply this algorithm. And if you do it wrong, you end up in a really bad situation. So the way I told you the model works is you basically give it a key. It sort of picks a way of permuting this block out of a family of different ways to permute it, a really big family, right? Like if it's AES, you've got your key material. If it's using AES-256, then you can pick a bunch of different permutations. There's 2 to the 256 of them, right? And you take some plain text and you put it into that, and then it spits out a ciphertext. The problem with not having a cipher mode is you could imagine if you had multiple, like a length of a message of many block lengths, right? Then if you did that, where you just did sort of the simple way, like, oh, I'll chunk the message, you end up with something called ECB mode, which is really dangerous for this reason. So if you took that message, or the message which is, say, like some bitmap of the Linux Penguin, and you applied ECB to it, that's what it looks like, right? That is, you can pretty much tell what that is just by looking at the image versus the thing on the right, which is truly random. So the way in which you use these block ciphers is really interesting when you start talking about messages that are larger than the size of the block, which is pretty much anything, because blocks are not that big. Like in AES, the block is only 128 bits in size. Like, you can't really fit a whole lot of content in there. So how you begin to use that to do more encryption is very important. So there are lots of different ways, and we're going to talk about all the ones that are bad briefly, but there's one called CBC mode, which isn't itself bad, but it's missing a property that we want. So you can think about feeding it through and like XORing it and making it tumble, so that if you like flip a bit in the second one, it like makes everything in the third one incorrect. And there are ways of like judoing through it, but in reality, they're not good enough. Like, what you really want to do is you want to know that if a single bit has been changed in your ciphertext, that you can just quit. You can just be like, I'm done, I don't want to touch it, somebody mangled the message, I don't want to believe it anymore, right? That's ultimately the strongest guarantee that you could have, is that the ciphertext is just not malleable at all. It's like they make any changes to it and you throw it out, right? And that type of encryption that combines those two steps is called an AEAD. So authenticated encryption with additional data. And all that means is there's a way of combining the encryption step and the ciphertext that gets output. There's a way of mixing that with these special mathematical functions that basically will tell you when a bit has been flipped. And you can know to throw out the message and cry foul. So a little bit like, this might look like ECB mode, but one of the ways in which this is done is there's this thing called Countermode, where rather than taking the message, you take some counter and you encrypt that instead. And since they have these block ciphers that are worth their salt, have this nice property that the contents of the ciphertext are not related to the plain text, it really will produce ciphertext that's not easily reversible. And you can take this and you can combine it with that function. Now, basically what I showed you with Countermode, right, is that unless you do that step of authenticating it, you can have a really bad problem. And this is one that came from a real audit. So they had some JSON that they encrypted using Countermode, but they didn't use the macking part of that. And what this means, and this also would fail in CBC mode, but since that last block in CBC mode and in counter mode, you can flip bits in it without being detected, it just turned out that in their blob of JSON, the way that they used an enum to indicate whether to withdraw or deposit between 0 and 1. It's like the perfect example of an exploit, right? So if you flip the 0 to a 1 or the 1 to a 0, you're now depositing or withdrawing, and you, the attacker, can control it. And their server had no idea at all. This was a financial services company, like as in bank. This is like every bank's worst nightmare, right? You don't know when you're going to withdraw or deposit money, which is terrifying. So the rule of thumb here is you need to avoid ciphertext malleability. Something being encrypted does not mean that it's secure. You need to also make sure that you can't begin changing stuff in the resulting ciphertext. So the rule of thumb here is just fail fast and run away. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, but this is a real good property in cryptography. Don't recover. Just die and run away and scream and then leave and make them try again. And we'll skip that, but that's how it's implemented. Some examples of things that are AEADs. There's this thing called Galois Countermode. There's Countermode with Poly 1305. For example, this is what Google and a lot of other companies are advocating for. I know Cloudflare is using Cha-Cha Poly now. If you can't afford or use either of those two because of regulatory reasons, you can always use encrypt then MAC, which is just encrypt it and then use an HMAC, which we'll talk about later. But you definitely want to do it in that order. Encrypt it, then MAC it. Like I said before, you want to be really careful with nonces and MAC keys in terms of reuse. Make sure that you're using stuff that's fresh. So on that, let's talk about MACs a little bit. There's this really cool thing that Moxie Marlinspike talked about called the principle of, or what is it, the cryptographic doom principle, right? Which the long and short of it is, if you do anything with a message before you verify the MAC, you're going to end up into a whole lot of problems. And the reason why has a lot to do with some of the stuff we've already seen, like timing attacks. And basically what you do is you have the ability to get some additional information based on how this message is treated. Whereas if you just verify the MAC, at least you know that like what I've received, it's constant time, right? You're going to read the message, verify the MACs, and then proceed. Versus, oh, this is like a 60% fail or an 80% fail, because things like that are side channels that begin to help you break the algorithm. So, in line of that, what is the right MAC, or what is the right sort of constructions to be using to MAC a message, right? And we're going to talk about the one that I've seen most commonly, and I see this in most of our audits, which is really troubling, because that is probably an indication that it's in a lot of the internet too, and a lot of the services that we use, which is really kind of terrifying. But in order to explain why it's bad, I'm going to start with explaining how SHA-1 works, how MD5 work. There's a family of these pseudorandom functions that have this property, which goes something like this. So if you think about it, hash functions are like a compression function, right? You take it, you put in a bunch of input, like could be massive, like the size of a hard drive or a terabyte, right? And it gets compressed down to this little tiny pseudo-random string, right? So it's kind of like a lossy compression function, right? And a lot of times what people want to do when they want to build an HMAC is they put the key material first, right? They say like, okay, well, the attacker doesn't have the key, I have the key, my buddy has the key. We'll start the message with our key, and then we'll make our message afterwards. The attacker can't forge it because they don't know the key, so they don't know the start, so their digest is going to be different, right? Seems pretty rational, right? Seems like that should work. So it goes something like this, right? You put your key into this compression function, then you put your message into the compression function, and then you put your padding into the compression function, and then what gets spit out is your hash, right? Just the state of that compression function at the end of all of that is your digest. This isn't true for all pseudorandom functions, but it's true for some common ones, like SHA-1 and MD5. They're for a particular family of hash functions that are really common. The problem is if you do this. So that output actually tells you something about the state of that function. It gives you like a window into how that computation is being done, and you can kind of inject yourself into it without knowing the key, right? You can essentially continue that pipeline from where you left off, including injecting your own new material into it, and even though you don't know the key, you can produce a new message that will still MAC. And a common example is, obviously this wasn't exactly from an audit, but you could imagine like trying to drop a bomb on an address, for example, a cruise missile or something that happens to use query strings. Very bad idea, but hey. In one it says false, but because of the way this particular protocol works, or the way this particular method works with query strings, right? It'll prefer the last one. You can just give it a bunch of garbage, and then at the very end set something like bomb equal to true, and then that will pass. And then now you've been able to create a new message under that key that is totally bogus. So this is called a length extension attack. And there's a bunch of hash functions, all the ones listed above, that are vulnerable to it. And it turns out that it's actually more complicated than you would think to actually use those algorithms well as an HMAC. You can use certain constructions, there's an RFC for it, but it's just kind of a pain. It gives you more ways of potentially blowing your legs off, which you always want to avoid in crypto. So the point of this is that you should probably stop using these older ones and just start using the new one, which is SHA-3. SHA-3 doesn't even really have any kind of special need for a weird HMAC construction. It's a different family, and it's designed in such a way where if you prepend the key, that's actually how you use the HMAC. So your intuition and the algorithm actually match. And it was designed that way on purpose. All the algorithms that were tested in the SHA-3 competition they had the explicit mandate to avoid this vulnerability. So if you do that, then you're good to go, and you don't need to know anything more about macking. Which brings us kind of to the end. I want to leave a lot of time in this talk for questions because I'm a developer. I don't know. People probably have questions out there about code they're writing or things that they are just curious about. And I may not know the answer to it, but I'll try my best. So force-save algorithms here, and this is where the part of the talk that's kind of nihilistic comes out. Don't roll your own crypto is true. So my advice, if I had to pick something, is just go learn libsodium. Which is kind of depressing, but it's a good place to start. And I would recommend these algorithms for anything you need to do to get your feet wet in cryptography. So if you need a good way of encrypting a bunch of binary under a key, SHA-20 and Poly 1305 are good places to start. That'll give you your AEAD. It's fast. It works great on x86. It's good to go. If you need to take a string password and convert it into something that you can use as a verifier or something that you can use, throw into HKDF to make into more key material, then I recommend Argon 2. It's a really great new approach for making sure that you can fight against an ASIC even on a cell phone or on a laptop. If you need to hash or if you need to digest or HMAC something, just use SHA-3. There's a lot of implementations of it that are good. Just use whichever one is standard for your language. And lastly, if you need, we didn't talk about this too much because this is even more complicated, but if you need a way of doing asymmetric encryption, I highly recommend you just stick to Curve 2.519 for doing anything related to like generating asymmetric, like doing Diffie-Hellman or doing anything that involves a signature and digital signature, basically. So that's basically it. I'd just like to open it up for questions if anybody has anything about any of our history or any algorithms we've used or why or mistakes I've made. I'm happy to share total bloopers that I've done that hopefully I don't make again. So thank you. I'll start here.
Yeah, I saw a slide up there, equals, that sort of put up a red flag. What's that?
Oh, it's a JavaScript thing. I chose JavaScript or ES6. Oh, sorry. One of the questions was why was there a triple equals in one of the functions on one of the slides? In ES6, like equals and triple equals, they do like types differently. So if you use equals, it will make sure not to say like coerce one type to a different type. So like string 0 and the number 0 will be not equal in the triple equals case because they're string and number. Yeah. That's kind of a controversial question, actually. Like some people believe that, say, like the NIST curves are not cool because it's NIST. I'm pretty neutral on the whole thing in terms of do I think that NIST like sabotage the curves? I assume that's kind of what you're. They do, which swings both ways. Like one of the things that was interesting was. If you look at DES, like DES got, or I guess it was Lucifer beforehand, before it became DES, but they got advice from NSA around differential cryptography. And that was an example when the NSA did something good for everybody. But yeah, I would say that it's a little weird that people can't figure out how they got the curves, that it just doesn't seem to ever come out. That does seem suspicious to me. Yeah. So I mean, with Curve 2 by 5.9, you can reproduce it. There's actually DJB. Daniel Bernstein has a great page where he talks about like the relative security of curves. I think it's like called safe curves. It's a really cool resource to look at if you want to see like why, for example, is P521 like potentially a problem. And yeah. So that's kind of my way to dodge that question. But maybe.
Over that's related to crypto. Say you found a flaw and have a peer review, and you have a collision, but you haven't produced it in a computer, but you've done over 1,000 times manually, showing that it'll work. Would you publish it, or would you try to get the same amount of computer power you need to do it?
Let me see if I understand. So you're saying that you, yeah, can you, let me see, how do I, yeah, if you could.
Okay, so I found a flaw in a encryption, and I had a peer review and some collision, but I did it manually, like using it to write the same thing out. Rather than final, over it, and like this and that, and came out with an answer. But I have not generated it on the computer with the exploits. So would you have to try to get the same amount of computer power that we need for this certain issue to do that, or would you just publish what you have?
Well, I think if you've had other people tell you that it's a valid exploit, and it's a generally known algorithm that's already in the public domain, just put it out on the internet. Like go to Hacker News and post it and see what happens. That would be my recommendation. I mean, you'll definitely attract a lot of attention if you make that claim. Might be unwanted, but if it turns out to be true, then.
What if the Asian researcher who first week in SHA-1 published about 4 or 5 collisions before, like several months before he even had a reviewable version of a paper describing it. And that just the fact that he was able to produce collisions for an algorithm that wasn't supposed to allow that as a feasible possibility.
That's a big freaking deal. Yeah. So. Yeah. I mean, these functions, like these pseudorandom functions, should not have that property, right? So if you can demonstrate it, that it has, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So.
You don't have any detail.
Yeah.
While we're on the subject, what might this have to do with preempt resistance?
What you mean, like having that property of preempt resistance? Like you better have it. like. Oh, you mean like. Whoop. Oh crap! I went down here. Yeah, I mean there are several properties that you want to make sure that your digest has. Preempt resistance is one. You just want to make sure that, given a particular message, I mean, there's a couple properties that come intuitionally, right? Like if you have a message X that has some digest like D, you don't want to be able to find a message X prime that has the same D. You also, by that same token, don't want to have, say for example, so that in that way you're going from D back to a different message, right? You also don't want to be able to have a message X that produces D and an X prime and be able to guess. You don't want to be able to somehow predict with more certainty what D prime looks like than guessing random bit flips, right? So those are examples of properties that you want to make sure your algorithm needs to have, otherwise you're on really shaky ground as a hash.
Just a remark, I prefer to use AES on x86 just because it has a hardware accelerator.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's no argument there. Yeah, if you're looking for raw performance, 100% correct. Like, they say, Cha-Cha advertises it's fast on x86, but the Intel instructions are built right into x86. So there's just no way you're going to beat that. So yeah, if that's something that you need, and for the record, I'm not an AES conspiracy theorist. I think AES it's legit. it would come as a surprise to me if it weren't. So yeah, I mean, go for it if you need that. Cha-Cha has some other nice properties, like if you're on ARM, for example, then you don't really get the advantage. So I think that's why a lot of companies like using Cha-Cha for mobile devices, get a little bit of a... Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to mix and match.
Is susceptible to those kind of FPGA type of attacks or not?
AES has other problems than that. Like, so for example, with AES, it's a hyperblock cipher that has this thing called an S box. So it's a substitution box. So it's a way of permuting the stuff in that block by, looking up something in a table, basically. The problem with doing that is that the amount of time, or whether or not something is in your cache, for example, tells you some information about where you're kind of looking in this box. This is I'm definitely waving my hands through this, but yeah, and it's a super side channel. So yeah, sure, I'm happy to do that too. But that, if the question is it really fast? Like, can you make a general purpose chip, not a general purpose, but a specific chip to do AES much faster than on x86? The answer is yeah, definitely.
I think what I was really going to ask is, opinion.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think AES-56 it's rock solid. Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. That doesn't mean there isn't somewhere in Fort Meade somebody in a basement is trivially decrypting all of our stuff, but or in China, yeah, or in Dongzhimen in like northeastern Beijing, but it could be.
The different padding attacks, which for example in TLS, which make it weak, different padding oracles, because with Cha-Cha it's easy because it's a string site.
Yeah, exactly.
There is no padding there. But IS, if you misuse the padding, so if you use IS-BCM, so you're using it in Countermode, so you're reasonably safe. But if you use IS-CPC, it's incorrect implementation. You get all these like side effects.
Yeah. So that's.
Read the manual quality to this.
There is a read the manual quality to this, but yeah, what you said is exactly true. So the thing about Countermode, right, or stream ciphers, is that you basically, in Countermode, you use the block cipher to spit out, you don't encrypt your message, you take like a counter and then you spit out like almost like a one-time pad, right, and then you XOR it. The benefit to that is you don't need padding, right? Your ciphertext is exactly the same length as your plaintext. The problem with other modes of operating a block cipher is that you have to be a multiple of the block, right, which, if you're 129 bits, right, which means you've got 127 bits of padding that you have to worry about. And there are lots of ways that can blow up that I avoided in this presentation. That's not one that we've seen in our consulting, but it's definitely happens, which is why Countermode is a great way to start when you're learning about block ciphers, because it's pretty straightforward. Like you get your bits, you XOR it, and then you want to run it through an HMAC or through an AEAD.
One of the comments made at the cryptographers panel at the RSA conference this year was that they thought the chances of there being some undiscovered problem with some of the newer algorithms, they didn't say catching, that's to be implied, that was a more likely problem than anything due to quantum cryptography.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Sorry.
So, I mean,
why?
feel safe with SHA-3.
Yeah.
Not to argue with you.
No.
Kind of views.
Yeah, so the reason why, if you go to NIST, right, and you see why they chose it, they say, well, we got real tired of everything being like the Merkle-Damgard construction, right? They're like, we're tired of that. Like, we want to get like some fresh blood into how people are thinking. And Ketchak has this like sponge construction, right? That is kind of new. Personally, like, Right. So like for example, right. So for example, I personally, I wouldn't recommend other people do this, but I'm a big fan of Skein. I think it's interesting because it's based on a block cipher. So it's kind of got some cool properties to it that are well understood, right? But I would feel like a crazy person if I told people not to use Ketchak. I think until I see an academic paper that like just shoots it in the head, they haven't done it yet. And I mean, the SHA-3 competition was brutal. There was a lot of people trying to blow up other people's algorithms. Yeah, I think that's at some point you have to kind of trust and trust, I think. It's a hard thing to do, but I haven't seen yet any reason to question its validity. I think they're right. Like, yeah, it is a new family comparatively. And yeah, I do think that's a bigger threat than quantum computing to crypto. But compared to what, right? I mean, compared to, there's a lot of, I think, bigger potential problems in crypto than Ketchak being like secretly garbage. I mean, anything is better than MD5. So to answer your question, yeah, like if I was on a desert island and my choice was MD5 and Bcrypt, I'd be using Bcrypt. Argon 2. Argon 2 or scrypt is also great. I mean, they're pretty similar in a lot of ways in their construction. Bcrypt is, I mean, it's cool. It's definitely slow. It'll solve the problem of time. I think the problem of memory is the big one. Like the fact that the new ones defeat ASICs is a big deal, because if we think about what's happening inside Fort Meade, I mean, they have a lot going on in terms of the ability to go fab up a ton of ASICs and just kind of blow through stuff. So that to me is really important in a PBKDF. Yeah.
What percentage of the code that you're seeing come through actually is already implementing Argon before you get to it?
Oh, God, like 0%. Yeah, like 0%. Like, yeah. No, yeah, 0%. I think if we, oh man, I see a lot of PBKDF too, which, again, it's not my opinion. It's not the best, but there's nothing like. Yeah, I mean that's the real problem, right? Is it again? It's a foot gun, right? It gives the ability to blow your legs off. You're like, I'm using PBKDF2. I'm using 5 whole rounds of it. You're like, that's not good enough, right? But to answer your question, like I think the bell curve, it's like all until you get way to the long tail, it's PBKDF2. I mean, there's like horrible, and then PBKDF2, and then right around the tail you get like Bcrypt, scrypt, and no one is using Argon 2 yet. Which is fine. If they're using scrypt, they still get an A+ from me. That's great. But yeah, it's not super common quite yet.
Use like recent more than crypto because of some compliance requirements.
Yes.
Is it like a
Like FIPS, yeah. Yeah, we do. I mean, that's like that's the stuff that drives us crazy, right? Because we have no choice but to kind of watch them sit there and use stuff that's not as good as it could be, right? But you got to work with what you're given. Anything else? Cool. I'm sorry. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, sure.
With that attacks and such, are there any particular SSH server configuration gotchas you can leave us with?
That's a good question. I don't think I have anything particularly insightful to add there. I think the sooner that you can immediately disable everything except logging in with an ED25519 key, the better. That's my piece of advice to you. Like the first thing take the shortest path to being able to only log in with an ED25519 private key. Get your public key on that thing and then immediately disable password-based login. So to give you an example, this is from another client. We had a client that was a startup that had some very interesting intellectual property. And they set up logging, like any good, reasonable company did on SSH failed attempts, right? They were getting hit so often by IP addresses from within China to test access to their root account that we literally use it as a heartbeat to tell when the server was still up. Like we just would tail the log and be like, are we getting hammered from China? Cool, the server's running. And it was like a running gag, but it happened so often that it actually was reliable. We didn't even have to write any application. We threw together a bash script that just tailed like syslog, and it was like good enough, right? So with SSH, if you can get to the point where you're using ED25519 keys, then you can go to bed at night on port 22 and you'll be fine. Or we're all screwed. So, or you're not the only one who's having a bad day. On our site, no, but there in Google, there's, I mean, I don't want to say let me Google that for you, but yeah, it's, yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, we don't. Thank you for giving me a blog post. So I can turn around and do that then. Yes. Was there an implicit question there? Yeah, I have. I confess I am not. Yeah, I mean, securing the transport layer is really hard. I mean, I have a lot of, yeah, I guess I'm in a glass house. Like, I've definitely screwed that up more than once. So I don't know if I can throw too many stones at them. What I can say is that I think there's really cool stuff happening with stuff like noise pipes and the noise protocol coming out of, I know Trevor Perrin, I think it was Trevor Perrin has been working on it or owns it or whatever. But it's, that's in my opinion, a really interesting way of jujitsuing some of the complexity of TLS. If you're, again, it's getting pretty close to roll your own crypto territory there, but it's a really simple protocol for setting up a secure transport. So if you're looking to kind of replace some of the complexity you see in TLS 1.3, it might be a cool thing to look at. Cool, well, I'll be up front. I'm just going to get off the stage now before I say something stupid. So thank you.